All right, guys, welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about Chapter 11. We're going to be talking about host-based and wireless attacks. We're going to be looking at how attackers move from gaining initial access to eventually exploiting specific vulnerabilities on a host machine. Then we're going to transition into securing wireless networks. All right, so here's our roadmap for today. We're going to cover service exploits, which include things like buffer overflows and system misconfigurations. Then we'll discuss about antivirus evasion, and this is how malware itself is going to bypass detection. Then we'll talk about privilege escalation, which is the process from getting from a standard user to an admin root user. And finally, we'll wrap up with some wireless security, cracking Wi-Fi, and the dangers of rogue access points. All right, so let's talk about exploiting services. This phase involves attacking the actual software running on the host machine. Now, this type of exploitation are very common vectors. And so we're going to be talking about buffer overflows, format strings, vulnerabilities, and then exploiting various misconfigurations of the applications themselves. Okay, so let's start with buffer overflows. Now, a buffer overflow is exactly what it sounds like. Think of it like pouring too much water into a glass. We're writing more data into the memory buffer than it was designed to hold. Now, what this is going to do is it's going to cause data to spill over and overwrite adjacent memory. Now, if this happens, an attacker can overwrite the return address to hijack programs' controls and target things like instruction pointers. Okay, that's the EIP. And if this happens, then we can mess with the heap. Okay, the heap themselves, they're going to start attacking dynamic memory and how the program itself behaves. Now, modern operating systems don't just let this happen, okay? They're going to have built-in data protections, something like DEP, data execution prevention, and this is going to make the stack non-executable. However, attackers can bypass this by using a technique like ROP, which is return-oriented programming. We have other things like ASLR, which randomizes the memory location so attackers can't easily guess where the code is. Now, attackers can still bypass this by finding information by doing info leaks, okay, or just brute forcing addresses, just getting lucky. And then finally, we have canaries, a secret value placed before the return address. If the attacker can leak the canary value, they can bypass the protection all in all. And so the canaries were put there as a detection for data execution prevention. But if we could leak that return address before we get to canary, data execution prevention won't work at all. Now, often attackers don't just need to bother with very complex memory corruption, because this is a very complex attack. They'll go for something easy, the low-hanging fruit, and we like to call it misconfigurations. This is always easier, okay? They're going to be looking for credentials left in production, like admin, or secure file permissions that let them access systems that they probably shouldn't have been able to access from the beginning. Now, once the attacker has a foothold as a standard user, the immediate next goal is going to be privilege escalation. This is part of becoming an administrator on the Windows machine or root on a Linux machine. And we can look at specific techniques for both platforms as well as kernel level exploits. On Windows, a very common escalation path is going to be the service issue. If a low privilege user can modify a service executable or even its configuration file, they can swap it out with a malicious binary. Now, when that service starts up, and maybe that service is currently running a system, the malware now will have full privileges as system. So they'll just swap it out. Another classic flaw will be the unquoted service path. And if the file path has spaces or no quotes, Windows might try to execute like program.exe, but drop the C before it ever reaches the application. So they can find a different path without utilizing the proper path. Other Windows techniques might include DLL hijacking. This is where you place a malicious DLL file in a directory that the application searches for before it finds the legitimate system directory. We often see UAC bypass, where it will silently elevate medium integrity administrator to high integrity without triggering that annoying UAC pop-up. And then finally, we have what we call a potato attack, like juicy or rotten potatoes, okay? This is an exploit where a service account itself can grab system access. Okay, this is going to be an impersonation exploit. On Linux, a lot of the vector is going to be on the suid binary. Now, a suid bit allows the binary to run with the permissions of the file owner. Think of the sticky bit, remember that? Now, which often, in a lot of cases here, is going to be root. So if we can find a binary like find or vim or an older version of nmap that has a suid bit set, attackers can abuse it to spawn a root shell. You can always reference the GTFO bin project online for the exact commands to exploit these. And yes, the GTFO does mean exactly what you think it means. Linux misconfigurations are another gold mine. So if you think about scheduled cron jobs running as root, where they can be exploited if the script they're executing is writable. So maybe you're able to edit a scheduled task as your standard user, and when it gets ran, it's going to be ran as administrator. World writable files are heavily targeted because if you can write to things like etc password, you can literally just add a new root user to the system. And of course, you can always add the sudo rights to be allowed to run less or VI or something without a password. It's an incredibly easy way to escape your shell. Now, when all else fails, there's always going to be the kernel exploits. These are often called the nuclear option. A famous example is the dirty cow. This exploit is a vulnerability in the OS kernel itself. It has a very high success rate for granting root access, but with a massive risk of maybe crashing the system entirely or putting it into kernel panic. So this is like the nuclear option if we can't find any other way. Now, how do the attackers hide all of this activity from digital guards? Let's briefly cover antivirus evasion and look for like signature detection, heuristics, and obfuscation. We've talked about these before. Because remember, traditional AV is signature based. It matches file hashes or byte sequences against a massive known database for all known malware. Attackers are going to bypass this slightly by altering their code to change the resulting hash. Now, modern AV antivirus is going to rely on heuristics and behavioral analysis. It actually is going to watch the program and see what it attempts to do. To evade this, attackers are going to be using things like living off the land techniques or abuse tools that are already installed on the operating system. They may even write their own code to delay execution until the antivirus sandbox gives up and stops watching. Now, common evasion techniques are going to include things like obfuscation, where the attacker will rename variables or add junk to the code or just encode strings to break known signatures, basically just look like something else. Or we're going to start packing it. Now, packing itself involves either compressing or encrypting the executable so it only unzips itself in memory at runtime. Packing is a way that it can bypass a lot of different things like network detection or onboard scanning, especially when it comes through an email system. And then finally, we can use things like encoding. Now, we often do this with Metasploit. Metasploit encoders use This one, the Shikaganai, I can't ever say it right, which basically helps remove bad characters and it helps hide the payload. Okay, it's a different encoding methodology. Now, if we shift gears a little bit, we're shooting through this chapter really fast. We're going to start looking at wireless. Now, wireless is different because everything is on the airwaves itself. We can review different things like Wi-Fi standards, how passively discovers, how we sniff networks, and finally, how do we crack them, especially with rogue access points. Now, if we look at the wireless standards, these are the wireless standards we currently have within our ecosystem. WEP is completely broken. It uses RC4 and a weak initialization vector, the IV, and can be cracked in minutes, if sometimes seconds. So we don't use it. Many devices don't even have it as an option anymore. WPA is a legacy standard that uses TKIP and is highly vulnerable and depreciated as well. Basically, it was WEP with TKIP put on top of it. Still had initialization vector issues, and so we don't use it either. Now, WPA2 is the current standard. It uses AES and CCMP, but it uses a pre-shared key model. So it's definitely still vulnerable to offline dictionary attacks. And as we also know, this is susceptible to deauthorization attacks and handshake capturing. Now, if you can, WPA3 is the latest standard. It uses SAE, simultaneous authentication of equals, to successfully prevent the offline cracking attacks and also with the offline pre-shared key attacks when we're doing with deauth attacks, okay? Now, some of the tools that we're going to use in the wireless is, for one, is Kismet. Kismet is one to help discover wireless networks. Kismet is a passive wireless sniffer. It's going to listen to beacon frames and identify networks without transmitting any packets itself. So it's just a listener, it's a sniffer. Because it's completely passive and stealthy, it can detect things like hidden SSIDs the moment that a legitimate client connects to them. So if there's traffic on it, that's what it's listening for. Once we've identified the target network, we can use arrow dump. Arrow dump is how we're going to capture some of those raw 802.11 frames. And we can put it, we have to put our wireless card into monitor mode, which is promiscuous mode, and allows us to pull down all the traffic from the air, not just the packets destined to a specific MAC address. We're here to try to capture that WPA2 four-way handshake, right? That's what we're here for most of the time. Now, if a user is already connected, we don't want to wait around for them to authenticate naturally. So we can force a handshake capture by using a whole bunch of deauthentication attacks. Now, we'll use AirPlay in G to send spoof deauth frames to the clients. And this is effectively just kicking them off their Wi-Fi. When the device automatically reconnects a few seconds later, ArrowDump will then grab the handshake itself. Now, once we have the handshake, we can then try to crack it, okay? We're going to, step one is to capture it using ArrowDump. Step two is taking that .cap file and running it through AirCrack or Hashcat, because we're going to have the WPA hash here, so the pre-shared key hash. And then step three is going to be cracking itself. Now, this is going to be an offline dictionary attack most of the time. And our speed's going to depend entirely on our GPU or CPU, depending on which tool that we're using to crack it, okay? Now, another wireless vulnerability would be the Wi-Fi protected setup, otherwise known as WPS. WPS relies on an 8-digit PIN. Now, there's a critical flaw in its design. When the router validates the first 4 digits, it actually separates out the first 4 and the last 4. They're separate, okay? This massively reduces the key space from millions of combinations to about 10,000. So we can use tools like Reaver or Bully to brute force this pin and gain access to the network pretty quickly. There are other vulnerabilities within WPS, such as for D-Link and some older routers, who decided to use the MAC address for the machine to help identify what the WPS pins are natively. And most people don't change these. So when we pull up the MAC address from the SSID broadcast, we normally can then turn it around and actually get the WPS code without even brute forcing. Beyond just cracking passwords, we can use things like the evil twin attack, right? This is where we create a rogue access point that's going to broadcast the same exact SSID as a legitimate network. The goal is to trick users into connecting to the imposter AP instead of the real one. Once they connect, we'll be a man in the middle or an on-path attack and use things like captive portal to fish for their credentials, or we can just use there to be a sniffing software. Okay. Now we can use things like hostpad or other physical hardware to actually complete this, and our favorite ones are going to be that Wi-Fi pineapple, like we did in class. So to summarize the wireless toolkit, AirCrack is going to give you all the core command line tools you need: AirMon, AeroDump, AirPlay, AirCrack itself. If you prefer a visual interface, you can use Fern Wi-Fi Cracker. Okay, and this is going to give you a GUI, which helps automate some of these underlying tools. And then we always going to have Wi-Fi, which is a fantastic automated script for auditing multiple networks sequentially without needing to manually type out every command. Now, to wrap up this chapter, on the host side, remember we looked at buffer overflows, misconfigurations, and SUID binaries. For evasions, we talked about obfuscation as a key bypassing way of signature detection. And remember, even in the wireless realm, we don't use WEP. Please don't use it. And even exploiting WPA2 requires to gather the solid handshake, capture the four-way handshake, which we can do with tools like AirCrack. All right, I'm going to skip the lab. All right, so this completes our look at host and wireless attacks for prepping for the Pen Test Plus. If you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, we'll be moving on to the next chapter, which is going to be cloud attacks. I'll see you then.